Then I think we're good to go.
I don't, oh yeah, I see it. Okay.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And we are joined by Eva Bartlett, who is an independent journalist who's reported from Palestine, Venezuela, North Korea, Crimea after the Euro-Maiden putsch. And we're going to be talking about all sorts of subjects. We're going to get into it right now. So first of all, Eva, thank you for joining me today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on.
It's a real honor to have you on. And Eva, before we get into, the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is, can you talk to us about your background as a Palestine solidarity activist, and overall your thoughts on the state of affairs in Palestine, which is getting worse, which is getting more and more worse. It's not really getting any better. So talk to us about your time as a Palestine solidarity activist, and just in general your thoughts on the state of affairs in Palestine.
Okay, so I went to the West Bank in 2007, I believe it was May, and I went with the intention of joining the ISM, the International Solidarity Movement. But I did also want to be able to say at least that I'd gone there independently. So I went by myself via Jordan. I spent maybe 2 weeks before joining the ISM. In those 2 weeks, I met with this group called Combatants for Peace, a group of Palestinians and Israelis that are trying to encourage dialogue between, both sides.
Palestinians and Israelis.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting concept, but it's really, I mean, if you really look at the issue of Palestine and the occupation of Palestine, everything that's gone on, there's no balance. And so while it seems like a nice, lofty ideal, you can talk all you want, but the system is inherently imbalanced. So anyway, I wanted to be able to say that I had heard other perspectives, because I thought that was important.
Yeah.
But then I did join the ISM, and so I was there for 8 months in total. I had a visa for 3 months. I was able to extend it for 3 months. When I tried to extend it again, by this point I had been arrested twice. One day, 2 nights in an Israeli prison in an illegal Israeli colony near Nablus, and the other time was just for some hours. And after that, my name was, in the list somewhere. So when I tried to extend my visa to stay on as long as I could, it was denied. So I decided, well, since I don't recognize Israel's rule over Palestinians, I'm just going to stay until they deport me. So I was eventually deported after 8 months. But in that time, I spent time in some key areas like Nablus. Some people who follow Palestine will be aware that Nablus is a key city in the West Bank. And at that time, there were still active resistance fighters in Nablus. So the Israeli army was doing routine raids on the city, which meant they weren't only going after resistance. They were bulldozing entire families' homes, terrorizing families, keeping them hostage in their homes for days on end. Blowing up bombs in the middle of the city. It was terrifying. But I was there to document. Also, we were escorting civilians home. If the Israelis had done a raid on the city, invaded the city, and then imposed what they called a curfew, that meant anybody on the street was at risk of being shot dead by the Israeli army. So we would walk civilians to their homes if they had been outside the city before this happened. But I was also in other areas like Hebron in the south, which is an area that is occupied by hundreds of illegal Jewish colonists that basically run the city and abuse Palestinians, with the Israeli army standing by watching, sometimes participating, and the neutral observers that I think they're like a UN or an EU group just turn their backs and walk away, in my experience. So what I did there with other activists, we were just maintaining a presence with the hope of deterring the violence of these incredibly violent colonists. I did the same thing in Susia, which is like a more desert-like area south of Hebron, and it's an area that used to be inhabited where the Palestinians there used to live in stone homes or in cave homes. But in the I think it was the mid 80s or late 80s, the Israeli government basically kicked them out under some premise that it was a closed military zone, and then they made the area into a historical area where Jews lived before. So these people that had lived there for generations were literally, like, I think it was 100 meters from their homes, but now they're living in tin and plastic tent structures. So we would sleep in those tents with them, because colonists from the illegal colony of Susia nearby on the hilltop, as they usually are, routinely came there and would beat these people, who were mostly elderly, but also children. They'd steal their goats and their sheep. They poisoned their wells before. They basically abused them in every conceivable way possible, and steal their land. So I was there again to try to deter that, and also to document it when it happened. And while being there, I saw how these colonists just literally steal the land from the Palestinians that have deeds for the land. So in one case, they had abused elderly farmers so much, these farmers were afraid to go on their land, because they would not only be beaten up, but they could potentially be killed, right? Yeah. So in the interim, then these illegal colonists were working the land. They put a fence up around the land, they planted grapevines, and they essentially, I think it's an old rule that Israel uses in their system, their incredibly imbalanced legal system in areas that they occupy, whereby if the Palestinians aren't working the land, then it's fine. It's legal for somebody else to take it over. So those are the kind of things I was seeing there. But then after I was deported, and also accompanying farmers at the olive harvest, when they would inevitably be attacked by these illegal colonists. And one time I was with farmers and we were attacked by them. I think 4 or 6 youth that were slinging pretty massive rocks at us. And I was filming like this. If I hadn't been filming, it would have hit my head. It did hit the head of a farmer I was with and wounded him pretty badly. And then after I was deported, then the next year I went to Gaza.
And that was in 2007. Okay.
Yeah. So then in November 2008, I was a part of the movement, the Free Gaza movement, that sailed from Cyprus to Gaza. And inexplicably, we reached Gaza. To this day, I don't know why the Israelis didn't stop us, because they stopped sailing missions that followed, 2 years later, like the Mavi Marmara Freedom Flotilla. They were stopped, brutally so. The Israeli, special forces boarded those ships and killed a number. I think they killed 9 or 11 people. But the boat that I was on, an Israeli gunboat, did follow us like about a mile, I think, north of us. This is my little puppy, and did try to insist that we turn around, but we'd all agreed that if that were to happen, we would keep going. So in any case, it meant that I arrived in Gaza just about a month before the war broke out. And when the war started,
the 51-day war, right?
This one was 22 days. It was 2008-9. The 51-day would have been 2014. But yeah, exactly. This was 2 days after Christmas, almost around noon. The Israelis bombed all over Gaza at the same time. Everywhere you looked, there were these massive plumes of smoke. I ran towards the first one I could find, the first closest one, which was the bombing of a mosque and a police station on one of the main streets, which was quite close to the main hospital, Shifa Hospital. So there was, and I can't remember the number of bombs at the same time. It was a massive number of bombs at the same time, and inflicting massive damage. So then I went to the Shifa Hospital, and there was just a nonstop circle of cars, vehicles, like not only ambulances, but any sort of car that could bring wounded or dead to the hospital. It just was going on. I can't remember how long I stood there watching. It was just a horrifying scene. And after that, there were 6 or 7 of us international activists, and we decided to start accompanying Palestinian medics in their ambulances, because we knew that from experience that the Israelis will attack ambulances. They don't respect, international law in any regard. So we started riding in Red Crescent ambulances, and I was mostly in the north, which was very hard hit, like Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, Ezbet Abadrabo. And I was seeing, for the first time in my life, I was seeing dead bodies and mutilated, maimed people, and just hearing horrific stories. I was in an ambulance that came under sniper fire from an Israeli soldier when two medics during ceasefire hours, which were 3 or 4 hours during the day when supposedly Palestinians could walk in the streets to get clothing, food, water, or whatever. Two medics were on the street going to retrieve a corpse, and they came under Israeli sniper fire that followed them as they ran back to the ambulance. Thankfully, they weren't killed, but some days, I think it was some days prior, a man I'd worked with, Arafat Abdeldayem, a very kind man. He was a volunteer medic, a high school teacher, and very brave man. He was killed while standing at the end of his ambulance when the Israelis shot a dart bomb at him. So the dart bomb shredded him and he went into shock and died shortly after. These are war crimes. I saw when I was in Gaza City, I could see from a media building I was in, because I was with medics, but every once in a while I would go back to this media building to try to blog and get reports out or do an interview if somebody requested. And I remember looking out from this meeting building on one of the upper floors, and you could see towards Jabalia, which is north of Gaza, where Israel was raining white phosphorus down on the people. Which, by the way, that's my Twitter cover if you've seen that.
Yeah.
And later I would interview people in a different district, so not just the Fakura school that was attacked, but another district whose name eludes me at the moment, in Beit Lahia. And the family was terrorized. Half the family died from this white phosphorus bombing, which burned them, through their skin, through their muscle, right to the bone. Yeah. It burns. You can't extinguish it unless you're able to completely remove any oxygen, which people didn't know, and they would be pouring water on it and making it worse.
Jesus.
And this poor family, they had been terrorized by the Israeli army in the area, and then finally this happens, and they try to leave, to walk, to get care for the remaining survivors of the family, and they tried to take their dead with them, and the person driving, I think it was a tractor, is sniped and killed, one of their cousins, I think. So they have to walk on foot to a point where they can reach a hospital. And when I went to see their home afterwards, and the Israelis had occupied it, and they'd written all sorts of horrible graffiti inside. They did that in many homes that I saw. They were saying, this is because of Hamas. You brought this upon yourself. Next time will be worse. And I remember reading that and thinking, my God, a baby, an infant burned to death. And then her corpse was gnawed on by wild dogs. It sounds like a movie, but I saw the photo. And how the family lost half their family. How could it possibly be worse next time? But they always think of a way to make it worse, indeed. So anyway, when I was there in Gaza, also what I was doing with other activists was accompanying farmers and fishers in the border region and on the sea, because they come under intense machine gun fire by the Israeli army for no reason. It's pure harassment. The Israelis will say they're defending themselves. They'll say farmers were in the border zone, the no-go zone, but it's not true. We would be 500, 600 meters from the border. The Israeli jeeps would stop at the border fence, the fence enclosing Gaza. And then they just start firing on farmers. Sometimes they'd wait. I remember one occasion they waited. We'd been on the land for 2 hours. They were harvesting parsley. They packed it into the back of a pickup truck, and they were trying to push the truck because it had stalled. And as they were pushing, the army started firing. So we were standing here like this with bullets going past us. They fired around us and shot a young laborer in I think it was his ankle. And a few weeks prior, they had shot his cousin in his neck and killed him. And these two men were the breadwinners of their very poor and large family. So these are the things that happen on a near daily basis. And this means now this family is out of income, and they're reliant on food aid for their existence. And in other cases, it's families who can't work on their own land. And so, we were trying to both enable them to be on their land and also to document these crimes against Palestinian civilians. Same thing happens on the sea, except it's more intense because they use heavier machine gun fire. They use shelling. They will take the fishing trawlers and abduct the Palestinian fishers. If they're returned to Gaza, it's without their trawlers, so now they can't work, or else they just destroy the boats. They'll even fire at fishers that are on this boat that looks like a surfboard. It's called a hasaka. And they basically paddle their boat out a kilometer or so off the coast. They drop their nets, they paddle in, later they pull in the nets. So they'll shoot at these skinny Palestinian fishers standing in their boats, clearly unarmed, only like a kilometer off the coast. So it's purely harassment. It's really it's one of their many genocidal policies intended to punish them because Hamas is in power, whether or not you like Hamas. They did vote for them. Okay, I later saw a lot of corruption by Hamas, and I don't support them. But at the first, they did vote for them. And Richard Gere was all out saying, Palestinians, go vote, and then they chose the wrong party. But I mean, nonetheless, like, you can't punish 2 million civilians, but that's precisely what Israel does, And there's many more things, but I've been talking, so I'll let you say some words.
Well, actually, you took the words right out of my mouth when it comes to, because I was going to ask you, Eva, let's be objective towards the Israelis. The Israelis gave Gazans the right to vote, and they gave and the Palestinians voted for Hamas, which, if you believe the popular narrative, Hamas apparently has this policy where they want to wipe Israel off the map and so forth like that. And there is no doubt that Hamas is very much a of the radical Islamist persuasion. But apparently little is actually known that actually Hamas actually does recognize the state of Israel. They would like a 20-year ceasefire with Israel, get back to the negotiating table, and then figure out, okay, are we going to have a two-state solution, or are we going to have a democratic one-state solution in which we are as equals? Actually, so can you actually talk about that? Because not much is known about that element of Hamas. It's all, they're radical Muslims that want to destroy everyone that's that doesn't subscribe to their theology.
Well, that's Zionist propaganda, I mean, I'm going to just divert for a moment to Syria. Syria's Grand Mufti, Sheikh Hassoun, he's a lovely man who I've had the privilege to meet on many occasions and to interview. And his son, Saadi, was assassinated by radical terrorists that the West calls rebels. Now I forget which year, I'm sorry about that, but it might have been 2012 or 13. Mm-hmm. And immediately after his son was assassinated, Mufti Hassoun was in a public speech. He was crying, but he was saying to the murderers of his son, I forgive you, come back to Syria, like come back as in like drop your weapons, let's all reunite. But I think it was in that speech where he was warning the West, you're supporting terrorism, but it will, I don't want to use the term blowback, but it will come back to you. Now, a Zionist site, I think it's Memory, MEMRI, took his speech and mistranslated it to make him appear to be saying, we will send suicide bombers your way. And that's not what he was saying. He might have said something to the effect that these suicide bombers will eventually come back your way, but he wasn't threatening Europe. So I just mentioned that to say, like, back to Hamas, the Zionists will do anything to distort things in favor of their narrative. I'm not actually an expert on the political parties in Palestine, so I can't say a whole lot more. Hamas is Muslim Brotherhood, and they are radical. And whereas before, my very naive stance, because I fell into things as an activist, and I've been on an uphill learning curve, and I will admit that. Initially, I was supportive of Hamas being elected because I thought that's what the people wanted, and Fatah are extremely corrupt. But it actually, my personal opinion is Palestinians really don't have any good representation, period, whether it's Hamas or Fatah. There are individuals. You mentioned the one democratic state, and I know Haider Eid in Gaza, he's an independent, I don't know if you can call him a politician, but he's very political, and he supports a one democratic state for the reasons that I'm sure you're aware, like you said, so we can be as equals. Because anybody who follows Palestine knows that a two-state solution is it's not even laughable, it's tragic. Palestinians would have nothing. They already have nothing. I mean, it's ridiculous if you look at the map of what Palestinians are allotted and the reality of all the illegal colonists and all that. There's no way they would ever have any rights in a two-state solution. But I do support resistance. They have the right under, and I've been decimated by Zionists for saying this, but of course, if you support international law, Palestinians are an occupied people. They have the right under international law to resist. So in that sense, like I would support resistance parties, but I don't support any radical, I don't want to say only radical Islam, any radical religion or persuasion.
And before we, you mentioned Syria, before we get on to Syria, I then have to ask this follow-up question when it comes to Palestine, which is now I'm of the I have a very bleak view that things are not going to get better with Israel Palestine, and the reason why I say that is because, and I want your thoughts on this, is Israel is fully annexing the West Bank. I mean, they've been annexing the West Bank since Israel's formed. But it keeps going on and on, the illegal settlements, as well as the monstrous economic blockade of Gaza.
Yeah.
And then we still have the issue of the so-called progressive, socialist, liberal, and everything except Palestine. And I'm still shocked to the core that when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party of Britain, now this is a guy who on his CV has a great, human rights, solidarity, track record. But when he was leader of the Labour Party, instead of pushing back against the ridiculous smear campaigns and the slanders that he was an anti-Semite and that the Labour Party was filled with anti-Semites saying anti-Semitic things, instead of calling BS to that smear campaign,
yeah,
Corbyn and his entire leadership team actually threw under the bus those Palestine solidarity activists, many of them, which I have to emphasize, were Jewish anti-Zionists.
Right.
So that being said, I mean, what hope is there for a just solution to Palestine, given that we still have that people who are ready to throw Palestine under the bus and people who just don't call BS to a smear campaign?
Yeah, and also given that the political system that we work in is inherently corrupted and flawed. I mean, the United Nations, for example, how many resolutions has the UN issued in favor of Palestine and Palestinians, and none of it is implemented, right? Israel, as I mentioned, used white phosphorus against Palestinian civilians. That's a war crime.
Also has an illegal nuclear weapon facility, but we're not going to talk about that. Right. Yeah.
They point blank assassinated babies and children. I took so many testimonies from parents whose children were killed. Point blank. It wasn't accidental. And this is not. I was there also in the 2012 war and saw again many horrific things. They drone struck a teenager. I think he was 13 or 14. Just a couple of hours before the ceasefire was to be implemented. They knew damn well they were striking a teen who was walking to a store to get food for his siblings because they've been starving for the last 5 days. And they did it anyway. They could see, I've heard with the drone precision technology, they can see the fabric of your shirt. They knew very well they were striking an unarmed teen. Anyway, the whole point being, they have, since inception and before inception, Israel has committed so many acts of terrorism and so many crimes against Palestinians and British but they've never been held accountable. So back to your question, I'm not in this current system where Israel can do anything, including illegally bomb Syria, including treat ISIS and Al-Qaeda terrorists in hospitals, including send weapons to these terrorists. And nothing is done, and it's an open secret. Everybody knows about it, right? Then I'm not optimistic. I want to be. I want to say Palestinians will have justice, but I think in this current system, the only way Palestinians will have justice is by armed resistance.
Wow, interesting. And I think that seems to be the only game in town. If the powers that be keep giving Israel basically impunity to continue on with their crimes against humanity, right?
Yeah.
Which leads us to Syria. Now, Eva, you're one of you've taken a lot of flack for pushing back against the narratives on Syria, including left-leaning narratives on Syria, who otherwise are against the war in Syria. So tell an audience, talk to us about how, if you could speak to a corporate news audience, the CBC, or even Democracy Now! And Pacifica Radio. How would you explain Syria? How would you explain Syria to them?
If I could speak to them, first to them, I would tell them they are guilty of war crimes and war propaganda, because in their misreporting on Syria, they have helped prolong this conflict, the war on Syria. If they had reported honestly on the terrorists that infiltrated Syria, that took over entire cities, that starved people, civilians, that were shelling the civilians, not the Syrian army, the terrorists were shelling civilians. If the BBC, the CBC, Democracy Now! Had reported honestly, maybe it would have ended earlier. It's not over, but maybe it, conceivably, if there was enough media pressure. But to the contrary, they did the exact opposite. And what they did was they excluded the vast majority of Syrians. They did not give them a voice. The media would say, well, it's because we don't have access to Syria. That's not true. BBC, CBC, these journalists have gone to Syria, and I've witnessed it with my own eyes. New York Times, BBC in Aleppo, November 2016. I'd already been there twice before, and I went another time on my own at my own expense. But this time I joined a media crew that went there at the invitation of former MP Farid Shahabi, because they were complaining, well, we can't see Syria. So he brought them there so they could see Aleppo. And we were there at a time when terrorists were raining bombs down on the city. And we as a delegation went to the main hospital, Razi, and saw the people being brought in. I'm sorry, my dog is dragging a carpet into the... very inappropriate timing.
No worries.
We saw the people being brought in, and we also went to the morgue around the back of the hospital and heard, the incredible mourning, the wailing of the people whose loved ones were martyred. The New York Times, Anne Barnard, went on to write, okay, she wrote about that scene, but then she had to equate that immense suffering with an event that likely didn't occur, because she was sourcing the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is one man based in the UK.
Yeah.
And he gets his information from activists and sources on the ground who are inevitably in terrorist areas and have affiliations to terrorist groups. So back to the media portrayal. Sorry, Anne Barnard, New York Times, wrote this story where all this suffering in Aleppo, then she equated it with something that probably didn't happen elsewhere. LA Times did a reasonable job in their writing. The BBC, I don't think I saw it, but I can only predict that it was shit, because all the reporting on Syria has been shit. And, I can give one more example. CBC 2014, I was in Syria for my first time in April. The terrorist occupying eastern Ghouta had shelled a school in the old city of Damascus, the Manar Elementary School. I and some others went to one of the hospitals treating these children. The one child was killed, 60 others were injured. So we went to the French hospital, and there I saw Lise Doucet. Actually, I said CBC, but she's Canadian, but she was with the BBC. So this refers to the BBC.
Okay.
Somebody was asking her if she's going to report honestly, and they were saying, this is because of the terrorists in Eastern Ghouta. They're shelling us all the time. She's like, and then she goes on to write some article named Russian Roulette or something like that. And she says the regime, the Syrian government, the regime accuses the rebels of doing it, but civilians believe it's the regime, which is such utter BS, because I spent a lot of time in Bab Sharki, the east gate of the old city, staying in a small hotel. It was a really inexpensive hotel, but it was one of the more hard-hit areas because it was so close to Eastern Ghouta, so that it was easier for the shells to reach there. So that area is being pounded with mortars all the time, and everybody there knew it was coming from Eastern Ghouta. You couldn't find a local and convince them and get them to tell you it was from the government or the army. So anyway, this is back to your question. I would chastise the media. I know they have their orders. I know they're towing the line for the corporations that own them, or in the case of the BBC, they are state funded by the UK, and the CBC is state funded by Canada, which they never seem to mention on Twitter. They make a big deal about RT being state funded.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I would say, okay, you journalists are just doing a job. You're just following the lead that you're given. You come here, you're not actually honestly coming here with the intent of speaking with civilians and then transmitting your voices. You're coming here with a soundbite in mind, and whatever they say, you're not going to include it because it doesn't match your narrative. And if they had included it, they would have had to have said, you know what? We don't like him, but Bashar al-Assad is overwhelmingly popular amongst Syrians. He has a lot of support. We might not like him, but they would have to admit that, and whether or not they like him is irrelevant. Syrians do. And that is a big game changer, because everybody in the West was believing, oh, well, he's an evil tyrant that's killing babies for breakfast, and he has to go for freedom and democracy. But in reality, he has massive support, and it's only grown over the years of the war, including people who are opposition parties or, formerly were against the government, but say now, like, we have to support him if we're ever going to have a unity in our country again and make the war end. But there are other people that support him because he never left the country. He could have been bought out and gone somewhere else, retired, but he didn't leave the country. But anyway, this is not about him, although the media has made it out to be about him. Like I said, they excluded the vast majority of Syrians, voices. They could have reported on the shelling of Damascus. They could have reported on the repeated suicide and car bombing of Homs that were being done by terrorist groups. But no, their whole narrative was the Syrian government, although they say regime, and the Syrian army are killing its own people inexplicably, just going haywire and killing for the hell of it. It doesn't make any sense. What they also don't take into account is the Syrian army is not a Sunni army. It's not an Alawi army. Sorry, it's not an Alawi army. So it's a mixed faith. It's a conscript army. It has people of all faiths from all over the country. They have to do military service. But a lot of them also are volunteers. They want to defend their countries. I don't know if I can say a lot, but many. But to depict them as Assad's army is just nonsense. It's the army of the government of Syria, the country of Syria. And I think also another point, like just a very general point, but just using common sense, if the tables were turned and it was your country that had been invaded by terrorists from around the world, and these were not just your average freedom-loving terrorists, but terrorists that are literally sawing people's heads off, including children, and are literally point-blank assassinating people in the streets, in public, in front of everybody, and are starving your people. Would you not do everything in your power to squash them? America would bomb entire cities to eradicate that terrorism. And so the Syrian army is not allowed to fight it. I mean, this is just complete nonsense.
That's said, because you often get accused of being an Assad apologist, Assadist, whatever the hell that stupid term means. But you often get accused of being an apologist for war crimes that have been committed, supposedly, allegedly, by the Assad government and their Russian counterparts. Now, push back against that and say, okay, all right, yes, they probably did kill civilians because most of the warfare is happening in literally like urban areas. So whether anyone likes it or not, innocent civilians are going to be killed, collateral damage, whatever term you want to call it. But push back against the whole Assad is as equally a war criminal as the people who have invaded his country, who he's merely just trying to kick out with support from Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah.
Well, I think to address that, we have to look at what is it they're calling war crimes. Civilians being killed in war is a tragedy. It would not be happening if the U.S. had not started this war, funded terrorists, initiated the war. They've been plotting against Syria for decades. And they've been working with opposition, radical opposition, at least since the 2000s, I think much longer. Mm-hmm. But if this war had not been initiated on Syria, I mean, if we want to look at, it's surprising that it was on Democracy Now! Of all places, but the Wesley Clark quote of invading X number of 7 countries in X number of years, and Syria is one of those countries. But there's so much documentation out there now that this war was manufactured from outside upon Syria. It was not peaceful from the first start. That's number one. The protests in Dara were not peaceful from the start. I have friends in Syria that participated in protests, and then they stopped because they realized right away after 1 or 2 protests, whoa, this isn't about political change. Like, they're calling for Alawis to be murdered and Christians to be deported from Syria. This is not what we signed up for. So the mainstream narrative was no, it was all peaceful and they were forced to take up arms. That's not true. The people in Dara were armed. I went to Dara even before it was fully liberated. So it was being bombed when I was there by terrorists. And I interviewed people that had seen terrorists come into the city. Well, at the time they weren't terrorists, they were people armed with guns or Molotov cocktails or whatever they had. And they were attacking security forces. Sharmeen Narwani wrote an excellent article about this. If I remember the name, I will tell you, otherwise I'll send you the link. The point being, she's interviewed, a lot of people have interviewed enough civilians and army that were there to show that the image that was being portrayed at the time was not accurate. They weren't unarmed civilians being slaughtered by the army. To the contrary, the government, after the first protest, the government told the army they could only carry batons, not guns. I interviewed one soldier. Okay, granted, it's his word against, the corporate media. His word was, we were sent down about 300 soldiers because there were these violent protests, but we didn't have guns. And on the Fridays, the protest would start after the Friday prayers. They would come down the streets and they'd be armed and they'd be shooting at us and attacking us. And we had no way to defend ourselves. And the soldiers and the police would run because this mob of armed people were chasing them. These are the scenes we weren't seeing, we weren't being told about. There was, in the Sharmeen Narwani article that I can't remember the name, I've quoted it so many times, but anyway, she cites the fact that there was an Al Jazeera journalist who resigned, Ali Hashim. He resigned because he had seen in, I think it was April 2011, armed men entering Syria from Lebanon with weapons, and he didn't record it, and then in May, I think it was, he recorded it, but then Al Jazeera wouldn't run it because Al Jazeera is Qatari owned and Qatar has a vested interest in the war in Syria. So they wouldn't run this because at the time we were being told, no, this is just an unarmed revolution. So that's back to the whole issue of war crimes. Quashing armed dissent is not a war crime. Firing on a hospital that has been militarized and turned into a terrorist headquarters that is not treating civilians and that has prisons underground that are used to torture civilians before they're tried in Sharia courts. Firing on such a hospital is not a war crime. It's not being used as a hospital and it's not being used to treat civilians. It's being used as a terrorist headquarters. And by the way, again, let's just look at Raqqa and how the US illegal coalition in Syria decimated that city. If you compare their destruction of Raqqa to how the Syrian army and the Russian and their allies worked, yes, there's destruction, but there's a reason for it. And it's not flat out entire cities destruction. Another point, when I was in Aleppo in 2016, November, I went to, I'm blanking on the name, it's a western district of the city. And I can't believe I'm blanking on the name. Anyway, it was an industrial area of the city. So it had been taken over by the FSA and then other terrorist groups. And there was a lot of destruction there, like just total destruction. But what you didn't see is that below ground, it was completely intact. So below ground in one of these FSA and then other prisons, no damage whatsoever. That's the reason there's so much destruction. They're fighting terrorism. The terrorists come up onto, ground level. They fire their hell cannons stuffed with, homemade mortars with gas canister bombs or proper missiles or other explosives at the military or onto civilians, and then they go below ground. So they get pounded, but they have to be pounded heavily, right? But this is an area that is no longer occupied by civilians. It's entirely terrorists, militants, rebels, whatever you want to call them, right? So, but this would be called a war crime in Western media. They'd say, like, look at the destruction of this neighborhood. It's a war crime. But no, you don't factor in the fact that there's no civilians there now. Or the destruction of the children's hospital in Aleppo. That's because it was militarized. That's the one I was talking about with the prison underneath. What about the war crime of the Syrian army using a chemical weapon in Douma? It didn't happen. So am I a war crime apologist? No, I'm a realist. I'm looking at things that did or didn't happen. The Quds hospital in Aleppo was destroyed and reduced to rubble by Russian or Syrian bombing. Actually, no, it wasn't. It's intact. There's damage to it, but it wasn't reduced to rubble. And it was also militarized. So, all these alleged war crimes, yes, I do admit civilians are dying. And the Syrian president admits that. He's not denying that. But it is a fact of war, right? And nobody wants that. And if they would, who is prolonging this war? The US, Turkey, Israel, and all the UN, all the institutions that are not allowing Syria to solve the Idlib question. What's their resolution to the fact that Idlib is occupied by Al Qaeda? Even Brett McGurk, the former U.S. envoy, something or other, he said Idlib a couple of years ago. Idlib is the largest Al Qaeda safe haven since 9/11. We won't go there, but so he's admitted it. It's known that Idlib is a safe haven for these terrorists and civilians. But what did the Syrian army and Russia and allies do in previous liberations? Aleppo, Ghouta, other areas. Yes, there was military attacks on the terrorists, but they also opened up humanitarian corridors to enable civilians to leave. Why was it civilians couldn't leave? Because the terrorists fired on the humanitarian corridors. And there are scenes of Syrian soldiers literally putting their bodies on the line like this to allow civilians to go past as terrorists are firing from behind. So
interesting.
Back to the point, like to solve Idlib, if they would if the terrorists would enable civilians to leave these corridors, but they wouldn't, of course, because they're using them as collateral, so that they can't be bombed. Because if there's only terrorists there, then they could be bombed, right? But if they have hostages
isn't the real point? Isn't the real point though that if war crimes were committed by by Assad and civilians got killed, that's awful. That's a tragedy. Somebody needs to be held into account. But we need to sort of step back and really radically, change how we even view the war in Syria, because the war in Syria is not, as you mentioned, it wasn't this, a bunch of peaceful protesters, which later big evil government gunned down, and so they had to take up arms back, and then we have a civil war. Right. That's not how we should be viewing, the Syria conflict. That it's actually a Western Gulf, you mentioned Israel, absolutely, a Western Gulf Israeli war on a sovereign nation, a secular, non-sectarian sovereign nation.
Yes.
And therefore, going back to, Alfred, Desaias, who I've had on the show numerous times, he said that international law is on the side of the Assad government. They have the right to defend themselves against this Western Israeli Gulf-backed cabal, and therefore Russia was legally invited to join the war in Syria. Isn't that how we actually should be viewing it? Not this one's a war criminal, and Assad is as equally a war criminal as ISIS, right?
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. No, that's very well put. I'm glad you said that. Thank you. And all the other forces that the Syrian government had the legal right to invite in, whether it's Hezbollah or other allied forces, they are legally there, whereas the US and its allies are illegally there, and they're occupying Syrian land. They're illegally bombing Syria, or not right now, but they have. But yeah, right. That's the context we need. That's the framing we need to be viewing this with. And that's what we'll never hear in the corporate media. I mean, my God, the Independent, on their Twitter feed, they still have the photo of Amran Daknish as their cover photo. That's a story. I happened to be in Aleppo. It was a pure coincidence when that story broke.
This was the little baby that was all banged up from a bomb, right?
Well, that's the story we were told. He was, I'm sorry, I forget the age, but I've been thinking about so many things. Anyway, he was a child who was shown seated in an ambulance with he's adorable, like he had this little mop haircut, and he looked stunned, he looked banged up. And so we saw the image that went around the world was that him sitting there looking stunned, right? And then if you watch the footage put out, I believe is either by the Aleppo Media Center or the White Helmets, he's sitting in the ambulance. I'm sorry, but this is just so ridiculous. He's sitting there for a good, I think it was like 30 seconds, and nobody's giving him any treatment. They're just filming him. I worked with medics in Gaza, not as a medic, but documenting. You would never do that. You would treat them right away. But anyway, he was a publicity stunt. He was exploited by the media. His father was extremely angry at the way his son was exploited. And that's why he didn't speak out at first, because this happened in, I believe it was August 2016. His father spoke out in mid 2017. The story that Western media and the white helmets and so on had us believe was that Russia, I think they were blaming Russia, they might have also blamed Syria, had bombed the boy's home, right? And then the valiant white helmets came along and saved this boy. The actual story was that the father is a government supporter. He's a former member of the Syrian army. He's proud of the work the Syrian army does in defending its people. And they were known to be supporters of the Syrian army, and they were surrounded by terrorists, and the terrorists routinely attacked them. This was a staged, whether it was like an accidental attack, or they attacked them and then they decided to use the scene, because they always like to have babies and children in the white helmets rescues, or whether it was or whether they actually knew they were going to do this. I don't know if it was an accident, like they attacked and then they just thinking of the word, made the most of it, or whether it was predetermined. But in any case, they weren't attacked by the Russians or the Syrians. And when the father spoke out in mid-2017, I was in Aleppo. I had been asking, hey, I've heard from local journalists that this family might still be in Aleppo, because as you know, when Aleppo was liberated in late 2016, people in areas occupied by terrorists were given the option to either remain in the city or to go along the corridors with them to onto Turkey. And so, only supporters of the terrorists and their families would have done that. Most other people would have stayed. Maybe some people left for economic reasons. Most people would have stayed, right? So that's why I was curious, I wonder if that boy's family, if they went with them or if they stayed. And it turned out, I'd heard from journalists that they were still in the city. So then it was a pure coincidence. It sounds a bit much, but it really was that I was in Aleppo at that time. The day that I asked, I was told no, by the way. I was told no, he's not here. And that same day he spoke out to Syrian media. So then I said, okay, I need to interview that boy, please, because it's a very important propaganda story that needs to be debunked. And so, basically what the father said was, no, I didn't hear any warplanes. We were not bombed by an airplane. And he said, my son was taken from me he didn't know by whom. He was, it was dark, it was chaos. He was trying to collect his family members into a room that was somewhat safe, and his son went missing. So what he learned later was that somebody in a white helmet or somebody took him and gave him to a white helmet, and then he was used in this publicity stunt. And Vanessa, who went afterwards, I don't remember the time, if it was a week or what, afterwards, she went to the area and also met the family. And she also met some neighbors who told her that, I'm going to paraphrase, I'm going to paraphrase, but anyway, she's got an article on RT about it. I think she called it the other Omran. And basically what happened was somebody else was going to be in the photo stunt, a much older victim, but then they saw Omran. So they took the guy, if I remember correctly, they took him out of the ambulance and put Omran in instead for the photo stunt. Unbelievable. Wow. The father was so angry that the terrorists and terrorist media, they tried to get him to tell their story. He refused. And they tried to bribe him. And I think they even threatened him, and he refused to tell, their version of events. That's why he was so disgusted with media. He said they were trading in our blood.
Can you, that being said, you already mentioned Al Jazeera and NGOs. Can you talk about Al Jazeera and NGOs' role in the Syria disinformation projects?
So I mentioned Sharmi Narwani and the Al Jazeera journalists. I believe there was more than one. I think there was quite a number of Al Jazeera journalists who resigned in disgust due to Al Jazeera's coverage of Syria. So basically, they were painting events in Syria as Western media. So again, a brutal dictator cracking down on innocent protesters.
Yeah.
And that has been their role throughout the war. And in fact, I was so disgusted by it. I really haven't looked at a lot of their reporting. I have an anecdote from the soldier that I interviewed who was sent to Dada. He said months after, so when he was sent to Dada, it would have been either late March or early April. He said months later, he saw footage of the same time when he was there, when the mobs were attacking. He saw footage, he knew it was that time, but it was being broadcast as live on Al Jazeera now. So that was one thing. there was, no, I think, yeah, it was Al Jazeera. A doctor I interviewed, Amr Gantu, sits on my YouTube. He talked about being in Dara, but not Dara city, Dara province. Sweetie, come here, come here. She's whining. Come here, come on. And he was at a military hospital, and he's a skin doctor, I think. And he said that day the director of the hospital, or the military director, I'm not sure, but the high up told them specifically, anybody who comes here, civilians are treated before soldiers, even though it's a military hospital. And so he said that day there were more than enough doctors, so much so that he was sitting around doing nothing. And so he was sitting there drinking coffee and watching Al Jazeera, and they were reporting his hospital was turning away civilians, wasn't allowing civilians in, and there weren't enough doctors. Yeah. And he's like, but I was sitting there precisely because there were too many doctors. Yeah. So, but there, I mean, Al Jazeera has been as heinous as BBC. And again, the reasons are pretty clear. I mean, Al Jazeera is Qatar's state-owned, state-funded channel, and Qatar was, I don't know if it still is, I don't think it still is, but was funding terrorist groups in Syria. There was a point when Qatar, a couple of years ago, when Qatar and Saudi Arabia were fighting. And the former Qatari prime minister, I think his name was Thani, came out and said very clearly, yes, we were funding terrorists, and yes, America knew, something like that.
Yeah.
So Al Jazeera definitely didn't have an interest in portraying events, honestly, in Syria.
So now, do you speak Arabic by any chance?
I speak colloquial Arabic to get by, so I can have conversations in Arabic. If you were to ask me about something scientific, well, I probably couldn't answer it in English either. But
yeah, well, the reason why I asked that is do you then like avoid Al Jazeera Arabic like the plague when it comes to watching anything Middle Eastern related, like what's happening in Egypt or Lebanon and so forth? Because and the reason why, and the other reason why I asked that question is because I interviewed Rania Khalek not too long ago, who also speaks Arabic, and I was saying to her, well, if Al Jazeera Arabic, because Al Jazeera Arabic had like fanatical wackos that were talking about like wiping out like Alawites and killing all non-Sunnis in Syria. This was Al Jazeera Arabic, not the nice Al Jazeera English, which really hoodwinks and co-ops, a left-leaning audience. And I remember asking Rania Khalek, I was saying, well, if you speak Arabic and you're watching Al Jazeera Arabic, which is saying this stuff, and Manar Adli of Minpress News, the editor-in-chief of Minpress News, who also speaks Arabic, is watching Al Jazeera Arabic and is absolutely horrified at this like genocidal television, then why is it that so many that so many people of a Middle Eastern background or a Muslim background are all very gung-ho about the war in Syria? And I was wondering, can you explain that? Why why that is when when you can watch something like Al Jazeera Arabic and go, okay, this is clearly like a genocidal war against Syria, and yet other people in the West are still determined to support non-existing moderate rebels.
So, sorry, my dog distracted me for a moment. I thought she was going to pull the curtains down. So can you just, what's your question? I heard what you said, but
yeah. So my question is, okay, if you watch something like Al Jazeera Arabic and you can understand Arabic and that they're advocating for genocide of all non-Sunnis in Syria, why is it then that so many people of a Middle Eastern background, the Syrian expat community and so forth, are determined to continue on overthrowing Assad, when surely they must be also watching Al Jazeera Arabic and go, holy shit, this is a genocidal imperial war?
That's a good question. Well, I suppose it's a couple of things. They could hold the same ideologies, so therefore they believe in it, and they believe this is a righteous thing to do. Or it could just be that they've absorbed so much propaganda that they think like, okay, well, even if they're saying these kind of controversial, risque, like things about, killing people and killing Alawites, it's probably okay because, the quote unquote dictator is doing this thing. They probably justify it. It would be my guess. They probably, if they're alarmed at the kind of talk that you're describing, then I imagine they're justifying it by, well, it's justified because he's committing war crimes. That would be my guess. I know that because I have been very involved in pro-Palestinian activism and writing, etc., living there, but I've fallen out with many people over Syria because from the beginning, I didn't believe it. From the very beginning, I wasn't there. I was still living in Gaza until March 2013. But in Gaza, power was out because I wasn't living in a fancy apartment. I was living with a family in central Gaza. So when the power is out for 20 hours a day, it makes it difficult every day. It makes it difficult to, get news. I would go to cafes and plug into the internet there and charge up my laptop. But anyway, the point being, I wasn't watching Al Jazeera. I was checking with sources I trusted. And I think Global Research was one of them. My friend, Ali, from South Lebanon, who's very tapped in. So I didn't believe the whole revolution narrative from the beginning, but I wasn't able to go to Syria until 2014. But all that to say, like over the years, of the smears, it's not only been corporate media, it's also been, what's that horrible woman's name? Like Linda Sarsour types, the pro-Muslim Brotherhood types that supposedly support Palestine, but are really like Muslim Brotherhood supporters as well. And so they've been very, very divisive. And I know people have been confused and some people have shifted. They formerly were horrible war propagandists and now they're not doing that. But I suppose one of the reasons for confusion amongst journalists, certainly amongst the public, has been not only Al Jazeera, but like the divisiveness from within the pro-Palestinian movement. People I worked with in Gaza, people I was under the bombs with in Gaza, were supporting the revolution and calling me a monster for supporting a dictator. And I'm like, but there's no revolution going on here. And he's not a monster. He's beloved by his people.
But why? But what confuses me about why people have but what confuses me about why people have jumped the shark on Syria is okay. Let's grant it that Assad is a mean dictator. Certainly Saddam Hussein was brutal. Certainly Gaddafi also ruled Libya with an iron fist. But that being said, I mean, but Assad recognized Hamas as the democratically elected government of Palestine. So why this turn on Assad? Is it just because they're getting a daily diet of Al Jazeera, and because many of these you mentioned many of these pro-Palestinian groups, or even all of these very well-funded Middle Eastern studies, do you think the fact that much of them are either funded by Qatar or some other Gulf state that has an axe to grind with Assad, or the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood does also have a very big network, do you think that's also why just like so many people have jumped the shark on Syria?
I think it's those things. I think it's everything combined. I mean, the propaganda war has been immense. I don't know how much millions, billions have been poured into propaganda. I mean, if you look at the white helmets alone, although their acting is really crappy and unconvincing, the funding they have is just incredible, and so that's just one army. I mentioned the Aleppo Media Center. Vanessa has looked into their funding more from the UK. But anyway, all these supposed media activists in Syria have had immense amounts of funding and support, including technical support and support in equipment, etc., from the West. And then just the relentless propaganda 24/7 in the media. So you can be a friend, I won't. You can be somebody who has, a couple of kids and works, and you tune in for your half-hour bite of news, and you're getting it from CBC.
1 second. Should we pause the interview so that you can take care of the dog, or shall we?
Okay. No. They're fighting over a bone.
Let's do that. So, folks, we'll be right back. We'll be right back.
Okay, it's okay. Yes, so sorry, just a dog distraction, but
Okay, so
anyway, I was
all
just
right, so folks, welcome. So folks, welcome back to part 2 of our interview with Eva Bartlett. Eva just had to quickly deal with a dog situation, but all right. Anyways, Eva, so you were saying about all of those people from yeah. Anyways, you were explaining why so many people in the West have jumped the shark on Syria.
Yeah, I mean, I was just saying that the propaganda has been immense, overwhelming, and relentless, right? So even if you're not looking for news on Syria, even if you're just like, I don't know, watching a TV program or listening to a late night talk show, you'll be hearing, like, at some point, you'll be hearing the talking points about Syria, about revolution, Assad, blah, blah, blah. So it's just been so overwhelming and immense. I think that unless you're somebody who devotes a lot of your time to consuming multiple media sources that are not, the Western corporate media, then it would be fairly easy to be duped by this. I mean, especially when you consider the human rights organizations are in on it as well. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, or you have like some seemingly innocuous or innocent group like the SAMS, the Syrian American Medical Society. Oh, well, that sounds like a lofty group that's doing good work in Syria. Well, nope, they have like a very special relationship with the US State Department. So when you have all these factors, I think Murad Ghazdiev did a report on them at some point, and they received quite a bit of money, if I remember, from the US State Department, the Syrian American Medical Society. But they're one of these bodies that will be cited in reporting on Syria, right? So I just think it's because the propaganda has been so immense. Although I do say shame on you, to people for being so gullible. I mean, come on, we had incubator babies, we had weapons of mass destruction. When is enough enough? When are you finally going to say, hey, maybe this time I'm going to question what the corporate media who have lied to us so many times before is saying,
I completely agree with you on that. And do you think, one last question on Syria before we get into Ukraine, do you think that another reason why there seems to be, because there seems to be a worthy victim, unworthy victim on the left, the pseudo-left, when it comes to Syria. So take Syria and Yemen. So Yemen is targeted under a Western Gulf blockade, warfare. They're killing anything literally that moves in Yemen. And yet Yemen, I see so many peace groups campaigning on stop the bombing of Yemen, stop the Saudi Gulf War on Yemen. And yet Syria, okay, it's not as weak as a state as Yemen was, but Syria is also targeted by Western Gulf Israeli actors through NGOs, through militarism, through the deep state of Canada, Britain, France, Denmark, Holland, and so forth. And yet I don't see people going, I don't see many peace organizations or online conferences go, stop the Western Gulf War on Syria or stop the sanctions on Syria. And again, do you think that's because of the fact that just so many of the NGOs and Al Jazeera, which, as you mentioned, funded by Qatar, has, for whatever reason, it has a sympathetic eye towards the Yemenis, were Syria just the complete opposites?
That's a good point. Yeah, and I mean, I'm thinking I can imagine some of the NGOs you might be talking about, or some of the people that are like calling for the end of the genocide of Yemen and not for Syria. It could be that it's safer to talk about that because what's happening to Yemen is very clearly a Saudi massacre of the Yemeni people and starving of them, whereas Syria has been more muddied by these lying networks and NGOs. So it's not hard to take a principled position when it's so clear as day, right? That innocent people in Yemen are being slaughtered and starved, but taking a principled position on Syria is more difficult because there's so much said about the Syrian government and army in Russia. So you have to have a bit of a backbone, it's called, to take a principled position. You have to have some integrity. So, Code Pink can cheer for Yemen, but they were part of the, people think Code Pink is all anti-war. They were propaganding the Syria propaganda as well. They were claiming Assad was starving civilians in Madaya. Assad is starving civilians in Aleppo. Yep, they had petitions about the brutal dictator starving civilians. So they're, in my book, they're either opportunists or controlled opposition. We don't have to get into that, but they're an example of a group that I could see very, very loudly yelling to end the war in Yemen, but not Syria.
Interesting. And before we get into Ukraine, can you also give me your opinions on why Venezuela, because you've been in Venezuela, you've reported on the opposition protests and the effect of sanctions on Venezuela. So that being said, why is it then Saddam Hussein? He was a brutal dictator, but and Gaddafi certainly ruled Libya with an iron fist. But that being said, why is it's just amazing how before the Iraq invasion there were people saying no war for oil, and yet where are all those people saying no war for oil when it comes to Venezuela and Libya? But I think, as you mentioned, there's a lot of insincerity and inconsistency among even the best peace groups, right?
Yeah.
All right. So then on to So on to Ukraine. If your dog will allow us.
I think it's my landlord. Set them off.
Okay, to continue, or
I think so. We'll hope they stop barking. Okay. Well, I might put them in the bathroom for a second.
All righty.
Hey, girl.
Very chaotic edition of 1+1.
Get it.
Okay. Well, we are back. I'll even find a way to see if I can merge all of this in one video. But anywho, so on to Ukraine. Now, I don't want to get too much into the background of Ukraine. I think we all can agree what was seen as peaceful pro-EU protests quickly devolved into a rival oligarch's right-wing putsch against the previous Ukrainian government. So I don't want to get too much into the details of that. But now there is a civil war going on in Ukraine, and you wrote about Crimea. So before I ask you about Zelensky and the current state of affairs in Ukraine, can you talk about when Crimea decided to become part of Russia after the NATO-backed coup in Ukraine saw Yanukovych? I think that's what his name was, the previous Ukrainian president. And talk to us about Crimea now that it's part of like Russia. And can you talk to us about like your experience there?
Sure. And I'll just preface it by saying, like, when events were happening in Ukraine, I was in Syria, and it's hard to be aware of everything that's happening when you're in a country at war and you're trying to report on that. So I wasn't following that closely. I was aware of the basics. And actually, I think we should just mention that today, May 2nd, is the 7th anniversary of the Odessa massacre, in which 48 people were killed, 6 in the street, and the rest in that brutal fire. Just horrific massacre in Odessa. Yeah. So anyway, I was aware of events, but only more recently, in the last few years, did I start really trying to follow more. 2 years ago, in what month was it? Anyway, I think it was August 2019. I went to Crimea. My first time coming to Russia, and I really wanted to see there. Mainly, it's supposed to be a beautiful area, and also I was aware of the huge amount of Western propaganda that Russia had annexed Crimea, had invaded Crimea. Sorry, not annexed, had invaded Crimea. And so I wanted to try to hear from Crimeans. So I had a friend who was translating for me, so I was able to interview people. Overwhelmingly, people I spoke with said they wanted to return to Russia. They view themselves as Russians. They're Russian speaking, their culture is Russian. And then also, similarly in Donbass, I heard these things. And also, life under Ukraine for them was awful. Infrastructure was not maintained. And then I heard more about the references to Odessa when I was in Donbass than Crimea. But yeah, I spoke to in Simferopol, I spoke with, I forget her name, I'd have to look at my report, but she's the head of a Ukrainian committee. It's like a committee to like bring cultures together. So she's Ukrainian, and I asked her about the referendum, and she said she wanted it to happen. She wanted to join Russia. Because I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly what she said, but anyway, you know, the will was there, and that was the overwhelming will of most of the people in Crimea. There was a small segment that was being backed by the West, a small segment of Tatars, and not all Tatars, but just some of them were being backed to stir up trouble. Youri Gempel, who I also spoke to there, and he's in Simferopol. I forget his position though. He was talking about how, I think it was the day of the referendum, like the small segment of Tatars tried to break into the parliament and tried to cause a ruckus. Or I think they did break in. But anyway, the overwhelming sentiment I got there was that no, there had not been a Russian invasion. There were not Russian troops in the streets forcing people to vote. I remember speaking with a woman in Yalta. She herself is a Russian citizen, but she lives in Crimea and she's married to a man there. And she was saying before the referendum, like in the lead up to it, people normally around that time of year would go on vacation, but she said people weren't going on vacation because they wanted to be sure they were there if a referendum actually happened. And if I recall correctly, they had wanted a referendum for 2014 or whenever it was. Yeah. They'd wanted it many times before, I believe, but this is when it finally eventuated. And then the overwhelming sentiment I got was like, thank God we're now a part of Russia and life has improved so much. The friend that I was with, we rented a car and he was driving around and he said, wow, I was here right after a referendum. And back then the roads were terrible, but now like he was amazed at how much infrastructure improvement had been done in, you know, the years that had passed. So yeah.
And so is it safe to say that that overall Crimea is that Crimeans are much happier with being part of Russia due to the Western-backed coup that took place in Ukraine? I'm probably due to that. Again, I don't remember talking with them so much about the coup, surprisingly enough, but definitely okay. They definitely, I mean, I think you're probably right. I just maybe I was not informed enough at the time to ask them about that element. Okay. But they definitely emphasized that the Ukraine did not develop their infrastructure. Like they didn't build any new nurseries, for example. The roads weren't well maintained. And then the woman I talked with in Yalta, she was just talking about, like, I can't remember the number of nurseries. I feel like it was like 200 nurseries that have been opened since then. And just everywhere I went, I was seeing signs of construction, so improvement of infrastructure. And right after the referendum, can't remember how soon after, but Ukraine basically turned off the flow of water from Ukraine into Crimea, causing a shortage of water. So like punishing Crimeans for their vote. Wow. And in Donbass, I mean, well, I don't know if you want to talk about Donbass, but go right ahead. Yeah, I'm curious. I'm curious what's going on and what's going on in the situation there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I went in, I believe it was September 2019, and I spent just under 3 weeks there. And I went to areas north of Donetsk. So there's a city called Gorlovka, and then periphery areas right on the firing line, on the front line. The houses, I was talking to people that lived in these houses. They were 500-600 meters from where the action was. They were from the front line, actually, and they were being fired upon. And Ukraine is basically, I guess, under the ceasefire. There's a certain type of weapon they're allowed to use, both sides, but Ukraine is using much heavier artillery than they're permitted to use. And there's a monitoring body, the OSCE, that's supposed to be there to monitor ceasefire violations of either side. But what I was told when I was there is that, well, generally during the day, although it's heated up in recent months, but generally during the day, they don't fire so much. It's usually after 5-6 p.m. that the really heavy firing starts, because at that point, the monitors have left So there's nobody there to document the crimes. Apparently they leave at like 5, 6. Yeah. And then it's nighttime too. So, and then what they were doing, Dimitri, the press officer that I was with, because surprisingly enough, in spite of my time in war zones, I don't know very much about artillery. So he's explaining to me, he said, I think they're not supposed to use anything, if I remember, over 82 millimeters. I think it might actually be over 60 millimeters. But anyway, they're using, I think it's 60. And over that's considered a violation. They're using mortar shells, which they're not supposed to be using, but they're not firing them from mortars. They're firing them from RPGs. So they can technically get away with it. This is what Dimitri told me.
Wow.
And they're using much larger rocket launchers with like one has, he said, a 30 to 40 kilometer range. One has a 100 kilometer range. I'm not sure if they're being used now. But as one indicator, when I was there, a young man from Gorlivka took me around and he was showing me areas that had been heavily targeted in 2014 in July 27th, I think. And they eventually called that day Bloody Sunday because so many civilians were slaughtered on that day by Ukrainian shelling. And when I was there, he said, well, the last time we've really been hit hard in Gorlivka was 2016. But now if you follow like Dean O'Brien on Twitter, who's really closely following this, or if you follow Donetsk news agency or other sources of information from Donbass, you'll hear that Gorlivka, the city, is being hit a lot lately. And so the areas that I was in, again, 400 or 500 meters from the front line, these people were mostly, that I saw, they were mostly elderly pensioners. They had nowhere to go. Their homes were in various states of disrepair from having been either hit with shelling or heavy machine gun fire, which can actually do a lot of damage and can start fires and causing homes to be burned down completely. As was the case when I went there. There's a house that was still smoldering and it had caught fire, I think, a day or two prior. And the people I spoke with, they said they have nowhere they could go. You know, where can I go to? This is my home. I have nowhere else to go. I have, don't have the money to go anywhere, or they just don't want to leave their land. But mostly it's they have nowhere to go. And they said it got worse after Zelensky became president. The shelling increased. And what else did they say? Well, there's one man I met so I went to Zaitsevo, I went to Mine 67, and Krutaya Balka. This one man I met, he was walking down the lane, and the village was divided into two segments. And the segment down the lane and out of sight was mostly inaccessible because of the Ukrainian snipers. So this man would have to walk down this lane in the line of fire of Ukrainian snipers to reach his home. And he, again, had nowhere else to go. So he continues to live there. And every time he needs to leave his area to go get supplies or whatever, he faces Ukrainian snipers. He said he'd been shot once in the leg. And he refused to do an interview on video. He only told me these things, but because he said last time I did an interview, that's when they shot me afterwards. I guess Ukraine monitors very carefully reporting on what's happening. And in fact, I learned today that my name is on a hit list, which is not the first time it's happened. It's Mirot Vorets. Anyway, it's basically a website that the Ukrainian leadership is aware of and can't do anything about because they don't want to censor. They don't want to interfere in media. Meanwhile, how many journalists has Ukraine imprisoned since the neo-Nazis took power? But that Zelensky doesn't want to interfere in media, right? So this website basically it's mostly, from what I can see, Ukrainian journalists or people that have done something to offend the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. But also, I will let Tim speak, but other people that have gone to Donbass are on this list, and other people that have even maybe just gone to Crimea have done something to offend the criminals in Ukraine in power, get put on this list. And it is a kill list. They don't have my address. They have other people's addresses listed. And apparently there's a report on TASS, Russian media agency. Apparently, sorry, I'm just looking for it. There was after the murder of journalist Oleg Buzina and politician Oleg Kalashnikov, whose personal data, including addresses, were published on this website. Initially, after that, so it seems like there's a direct correlation between their murders and their information having been published on the website. So it was under EU laws. This was apparently not legal. So the website was taken down briefly, but it's back up again. And in this article from 2019, yeah, Zelensky says there's nothing he can do about it. The Speaker of the Parliament says we can't interfere on the Kill website.
Well, that's a perfect segue then to a question I wanted to ask about Zelensky, which is why is Zelensky doing a complete 180 on trying to reconcile Ukrainians of a Ukrainian-speaking background, Ukrainians of a Russian-speaking background, or who are simply, Ukrainian Russians due to the historical link that goes back to those countries for over centuries? Why is he continuing this civil war? And why is he so eager to join NATO? Now, is it because he was a con artist? Is this because of pressure from the West, or the fact, as you mentioned, after the Ukrainian president, whose name I'm blanking out, I think it was Viktor Yanukovych, after he was chased out of the country, and you had these neo-Nazis who lionized Nazi collaborators in Ukraine. So is Zelensky, so was he just a con artist? Is this just because of pressure from the West and pressure from those forces, or all of the above?
Yeah, I have to say I don't know. I don't know Ukraine that intimately. Like I'm very familiar with Palestine and Syria, and to some degree Venezuela, but Ukraine I don't know that much. So honestly I don't know why. What I can say is since the Biden administration came to power, of course, there's been more push for war, not only with Russia via Ukraine, but also in Syria. Upping the ante in Syria. So I suspect the U.S. administration has something to do with it, but there might be other factors. I don't know.
Unbelievable. And have to ask a quick follow up on that. Were you shocked at the moves to impeach Donald Trump when he merely mentioned to Zelensky that Joe Biden and his son are war profiteers and he should look into them? And were you shocked at how people wanted to impeach Trump for Joe Biden's war profiteering? And I just have to ask your thoughts on that.
Oh no, I'm not shocked at all. I mean, my God, look at the left and the West. Nothing shocks me about them anymore. I mean, they're pathetic. But I don't believe in the not only the American but the Canadian political system. I don't believe in these either or kind of situation. And I say that also, with a caveat, I'm not a Trump supporter. That I don't support any of them. I think they're all just figureheads, really. But I will say, while I'm not a Trump supporter, I'm most ardently anti-Biden. He's a war criminal. Okay, he's now not the person pulling the strings. We know that he's not mentally there. But nonetheless, his administration are, full of war criminals and people just lusting for more war. And yet people I know in real life were so duped, sucked into the anti-Trump, like, oh, he's a misogynist. Oh, he's orange-faced. Oh, he's this, like, so what? He doesn't have nearly the litany of war crimes. Oh, yes, he did bomb Syria. I don't forget that. And yes, I don't like him as a person. And I don't like the things he said about Syria or Assad or whomever. But there's no way you can compare his crimes to those of Biden's, right? So people I know, people who are well informed on Syria, when it came to election time, they're like, oh, I can't wait to see Trump gone. And Biden's talking about healing and fuck. I mean, this is why nothing surprises me.
I know. I'm also stunned by it. In fact, I even had actually you've been on the program Slow News Day. I had Glory Jones, one of the co-hosts, on the show, and then this is a perfect segue. Then because I asked her about Tulsi about Tulsi Gabbard, who, yes, she's not perfect on every single issue in the book. I have some issues with her when it comes to Palestine. There's some things about reproductive right and trans rights, but that's a whole nother issue for another day. But on issues like war and peace and a proper Green New Deal and détente with China and Russia, there was no doubt that Tulsi Gabbard was by far the best candidate that the Democrats had, and yet I was very shocked at how even some of the best anti-war, anti-imperialist voices were very hostile towards Tulsi Gabbard. The best example I can think of is Abby Martin of Empire Files and her partner Mike Preisner, and Robbie Martin of Media Roots. They were very hostile towards Tulsi Gabbard. And do you think that, so what are your reflections on Tulsi Gabbard's failed bid for the Democratic nomination? And do you think that she got so much of that hostility because while it was brave of her to push back against Syria war propaganda, it's just not a popular topic compared to, saying end the war in Yemen?
Well, you're going to be shocked to learn that I am also hostile to her. I think that she is,
okay.
Yeah, she went to Syria. She met with Assad. She would have met Syrians. And yet she gets on Meghan McCain's show and completely capitulates to McCain's badgering about Assad being a dictator that used chemical weapons on his people. If she can't take the badgering of that idiot, then what kind of leader could she be? I mean, you have to be ready to take badgering. And she could have handled it differently. She could have said, we don't know. That's all she has to say. We don't know if he's committed a war crime using chemical weapons. But she didn't do it. Just like Glenn Greenwald in Democracy Now! Oh, I'm sure that Assad has used chemical weapons, and not just this time, but all times prior. Then he and I had a Twitter row, and I'm like, I didn't even know he'd said this because I don't watch Democracy Now!, but I saw something on Twitter. So then I looked at the transcript, and I'm like, holy fuck, he did say, pardon my language, he did say that. And then so I just entered into the fray. I'm like, well, actually, here's what you said, screenshot. And then he's like, well, it was live TV. Sometimes you say things, and I'm like, yeah, I know, I get it. I've done that myself. So what's your point now? Well, and then he said the same thing. So, but back to Tulsi, I had other issues. I met her in, I guess it was December 2016 when I was in the US giving lectures. She's incredibly intelligent. I'll give her that. She's very intelligent. She's a good listener. I think she's very clever, but I think she lacks integrity. I think there are other instances. For example, after I met her, I was put on her mailing list. And I got at least 2 emails where, when hostilities with North Korea were ebbing, she was sending out emails. I don't know if she wrote them, but they were going out in her name, meant, I suppose, to de-escalate, but I know you have to reach the masses.
She was basically recycling propaganda about North Korea. That North Korea is entirely to blame for this, and therefore we shouldn't go to war with them, but we should continue on sanctioning North Korea, right?
Exactly, stuff like that. So that's not a position of integrity, and I haven't really looked into her affiliations with Israel, but I've heard people say that she's she's pro-Israel. I don't know. And I believe she's speaking at some Israeli, I forget what the thing is. So I think, whereas I did admire her for taking a principled position, she's lost my admiration because, again, she did not need to capitulate neither on the McCain show nor in her North Korea stance. She could have, in both cases, said something middle ground like, we Americans don't want to go to war, we want to protect our own. But she had to go the extra mile and say, yes, he's a demonic lunatic in North Korea that wants to fire his, that kind of language. It's just circus language. And same with her capitulation on Syria. So
before we get into North Korea, which was the last thing I wanted to talk to you about then that said, your reflections then on Jeremy Corbyn, because it was not just Palestine that he completely threw under the bus, but also on every single issue that had to do with war and peace, Jeremy Corbyn completely pivoted and capitulated to the ruling class's establishment. And what's your overall
I don't have one. I haven't followed that very closely, so I don't have an opinion. I will say this, though, on
Yeah.
matters COVID, he threw things under the bus. I think he took a very strong position. Oh, I forgot what it was, but it was a very strong, maybe pro-lockdown position or something. That's all I'm aware of, but I haven't really followed, things to do with him.
COVID. One of these days, we definitely need to have a conversation about that, because I know we have our disagreements on COVID, but we're going to save that for another day, because I would like a proper discussion with you and Slow News Day on what should be the response to COVID, if there even should be a response to COVID. But on to North Korea, the last topic I wanted to talk to you about. So, North Korea. Talk to us about your trip to North Korea. Can you talk to us about your trip to North Korea, and then I'll ask my follow-up questions on North Korea. Following.
Okay. Well, I just want to first make clear, if you go to the Wikipedia entry on me, it's a complete smear entry, full of lies and libel. Yeah, one of the lies, the flat out lie, is that the North Korean government paid for my trip there, and that's complete BS. They paid for nothing. I paid for my visa. I did have an individual person, contribute to covering my expenses, but that person is a complete individual, not government affiliated in any sense, and that's it. The only thing North Koreans did was issue me a visa. So, and that's from last time I checked, that's not illegal to issue visas. So I was with two other people. This one person had organized the trip, an individual, again, not a politician. And my interest in going there was not to then say I know everything about North Korea, because I don't, or nor to say I've seen everything in North Korea, because I haven't, but to at least get a sense of what it's like, and to at least have the chance to encounter some people and hear their opinions. And so basically I was there for 7 days. We were obviously in Pyongyang. We also went to the DMZ, which was very interesting, by the way. An aside, when I lived years ago teaching English, some friends and I did one of these DMZ tours. And I remember the propaganda on the south side was so heavy. I remember them saying, don't point, because the North Koreans will shoot you. They wouldn't have shot, just to be clear. But so when you're in North Korea, I think one of the most overriding things is that everywhere you're reminded of their history, whether you go to their war museum, or you're at the DMZ, or you're talking with people who are informed about their history, you're aware of the fact that the US and allies tried to destroy North Korea in, what was it, the late 40s or so? And
1950s,
Yeah, and so in the capital, Pyongyang, I believe it was no building over 2 stories or something was left standing, something ridiculous like that. And then bearing in mind that after that, and I'm sorry, I don't have statistics at hand. I'm not a great stats person, but in my article, I would have written down how much of the population was killed, and I'm sure you know it. But after that, they've been under sanctions until now. And on top of which, every year, the US and South Koreans and other allies do war drills that basically mimic the destruction of North Korea, an attack on North Korea. So they're living in a state of psychological war all the time. They've been under sanctions for so long. And on top of that, in spite of that, I should say, they've rebuilt remarkably. Pyongyang is a beautiful city. Now, I was sharing videos that I was taking, and so the outsider comments were well, where are all the people on the streets? Well, okay, yeah, it's not as busy as a Western city, true. And most people don't have cars, that's true. They have an excellent subway system, though. And, it's a different society. It's a different political organization. It doesn't mean I agree with how everything is run. But I think, like you were saying about framing how we look at Syria, I think it's important we do also how we look at North Korea, what they faced, what they've managed to do, and also the fact that the news we hear about North Korea is again emanating from these Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International types, or defectors, like the famous young girl Park, who tells her defector story in multiple ways.
Talk to us about that. Talk to us about how about how North Korea, much of the horror stories we hear that there's like mass murder that takes place in every village, how if you don't dress like Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il, you get massacred. If a basketball team or a football team loses on the international stage, they all get massacred. Can you talk to us about how and these are all stories I've read and things and things I've heard from secondhand sources. But yeah, can you talk to us about how those North Korean, defectors, granted, I'm sure they're leaving a regime that they don't like, and they've seen a lot of things that they don't like how the government conducts itself. But that being said, they're lying. They're lying about why they're fleeing. They're lying about so many aspects of the North Korean regime. And yeah, so can you talk to us about those defectors and those lies, basically?
So I can recommend a number of people who are like specialists in North Korea. But anyway, Gregory, I'll have to look through my contacts. I think Christine, and I can't remember. Anyway, back some years ago, I was looking at these stories, and there was one case, a young girl, very pretty young girl. I think her name was Park, would be her family name. And she told her story, but it had different endings and different contradicting details about where she was or where she wasn't. So it was clear that her story wasn't like fully true, if true at all. And I remember looking into other ones where basically there was one story where I think a defector thought they were going to China to work. Next thing they know, they're in South Korea. And one common theme, aside from the fact that a lot of these stories were propaganda or exaggerated or manufacturing things that didn't happen, one common theme I saw was that there were people that had defected to the South, maybe wanting a capitalist lifestyle, a more choice and all this, and then were very unhappy there. I can't remember if it was their work conditions or what, and they wanted to go back to the North, and they weren't being allowed. They were being held hostage as the prize defectors. And now that I'm talking about this, I think there's a great deal of money given to people with defector stories, incentive, let's say, for them to tell these stories. So, but it's been a while since I've looked into that. But I would say to people like, just like all this genocide in China kind of stories we're hearing in Western China, Muslims being genocided, this is being spun again by Ken Roth and Human Rights Watch. And these are all bodies and people that have a vested interest in distorting the facts or just fabricating lies. You asked me like more at first about what I saw there in North Korea. So I mentioned like, okay, empty streets, but they had a great subway system, even if the cars are old, whatever. And so I visited this one factory. It was a silk factory. And the things that stood out for me there, not that I've visited many factories in the West, so I can't really compare, but I guess then I would ask, in factories in the West, do you have these pristine conditions where it's like spotlessly clean? You have water stations all over, you have coolers, you have fans going. People, even the way they were dressed was pristine, and these were people that were working all day. And they had some sort of board. So I guess it was like they get, I don't know if it was like they get paid a flat rate, and then everything they do above production, then they get a reward or something like that. But it was just like, I was surprised. It seemed like very good conditions in this factory. And they had free housing. I know Western reporters would say, well, no, they're just being kept in prisons, and then they go and forced to do paid labor. But there's more nuance. This is again, I'm not a specialist, so I can't really speak to how the society runs, but it is a different way of society, of functioning society. But like, for example, we went to a farmers cooperative where the people that were living there had previously had like huts and simple sheds. And now they all had identical little homes with solar panels and a little plot for their gardens. And they in turn worked in the cooperative, so there's a lot. I think I would like to go back so I could speak more authoritatively on, because I'm only seeing a couple of areas. You can't really say that much, but going from Pyongyang down to the DMZ, I think it was several hundred kilometers, you just pass lines and lines of fields of corn and rice, and so like all these stories of famine and starvation, well, they are under sanctions, but at the same time, I saw a lot of agriculture. And I just, Kim Jong-un does seem crazy. He seems bombastic. But then if you're in a country that's being targeted by the West with threat of being bombed all the time, you would want to have a persona that's a little bit wacky, right? To always keep people on the edge of their seats. Like, you can't predict what he's going to say or do. And they have every right to have, a defense system. If they're facing obliteration all the time, they have a right to defend themselves. Doesn't mean the system there is perfect, nor is by far our systems in the West. But I think the problem that many in the West, their problem is that they view things from a very arrogant perspective, thinking that our systems are so democratic and wonderful. And look, I can be who I want to be. I can dress how I want to dress. And the whole thing about like you have to dress like Kim Jong-un, no. School kids are wearing uniforms. That's common around the world. Schoolgirls have uniform lengths of hair. I saw that in South Korea as well. And in fact, I had the advantage of having lived 2 years in South Korea and seeing, there are parallels in the way the societies are functioning. Okay, not the capitalism, but some, the traditions still exist there. Even when we went to the DMZ afterwards, we visited this really pretty waterfall. And I saw a group of North Korean men and women sitting around on the ground with a fire, and they're grilling meats and drinking soju. And they invited me to join. I don't eat meat, so I just took some watermelon. And I was like, yeah, I've seen this scene in South Korea. So it's like, maybe these were all governmental elites that were sitting around, but I don't think so, The other thing is we went to an amusement park. And I know, again, the Western perception would be like, oh, only the children of the elite can go there, but it's not true.
Yeah, exactly.
It was so, I didn't pay. I don't know what the ticket was. My host, the person that I was with, paid for the tickets, but that's because we paid a daily amount that was to go to expenses. So I'm not sure what the ticket was, but I know it was cheap enough that kids were going there, not maybe every weekend, but many weekends a year, many weekends a month. And because I met some kids, and so with the help of a translator, I asked them like, is this your first time? No. I can't remember everything they said, but anyways, it's very inexpensive. It was a pretty cool park. Like I rode this gave me a good thrill roller coaster, and also this thing shoots you up into the sky and then drops you down really quickly. Anyway, like it was a fun amusement park, and it was affordable to kids. And I also went to this center for children's center that served 5,000 kids a day, completely free, extracurricular activities from things like scientific things to sports to cultural to music, and completely free. And find me a place like that in North America, please and thank you. And again, the line would be, well, they're just doing that to show off to visitors, to make them think that they're doing good. Do you really think they're going to really care what visitors think? I mean, okay, they do want to put on their best face, but they're very well aware of all the propaganda. And Kim Jong-un, being the way he is, he's very aware of the way he's presenting himself. So do you think he really is afraid that, oh no, a visitor's going to come here and think we're bad, so we're going to erect this children's palace to fool them? Like, it's just a little bit ridiculous. There's a fantastic, just in conclusion, a fantastic documentary made by these two Australian documentary maker comedian guys. They were going by the name Boy Boy on Facebook and their YouTube channel. And they made this great documentary called The Haircut. And it's all under this premise, which emanates, as they learned, emanates from Voice of America, from Washington, this premise that all men in North Korea have to have a haircut like Kim Jong-un. So they go there, and the one guy has like this great bushy head of hair. And they're showing also, while they're doing it, they're showing, scenes of Pyongyang, what life is like there. They go to a water park, and they're just absolutely ridiculous. But you see normality. And finally, they go to a barber, and they say, they see all the styles that the barber can do. And it's like a variety of wild styles. And then the guy chooses a style. He himself chooses a style of an American actor who happens to look like Kim Jong-un. So he ends up getting a haircut like Kim Jong-un. But his whole point was to say, like, look, you don't actually have to have just this one haircut style. And I interviewed them, and they said that they had taken a train in from China. I flew in from China, but they took a train. And they said there were I think there were American tourists with them. And they actually believed that all the rows of corn they were seeing were plastic. This is the extent of the propaganda that Westerners have been under, that they would think that the government is so evil and deceitful that they would plant plastic corn instead of just putting seeds in the ground. Like, it's ridiculous.
So all that being said, I'm curious. I'm curious then. Why do you think then? Why do you think there is a huge amount of poverty in North Korea, underdevelopment in North Korea? Do you think that's a combination of how they approach communism, or do you think that more has to do with the fact that they were destroyed? And I'm not even saying that lightly, but they were destroyed during the Korean War. So they're still recovering from that, just like how Vietnam is still recovering from the Vietnam War. Do you think it's a combination of that plus, well, you mentioned sanctions, and we've not even gone into the numerous sanctions that the West has on North Korea. But do you think it's a combination more of that as opposed to just like, your response?
No, I do think so. And again, I will reiterate that I'm not an expert in North Korea, and I did not see the whole country. So I'm not pretending like I know everything. But what I did see, I mean, even as I mentioned, driving to the DMZ, you pass villages in the distance, and I saw like villages with tattered old apartment buildings with solar panels on them. I mean, so it's not beautiful, it's not modern, it's not glamorous, but when you're a country that's struggling to rebuild, you piece together what you can. I mean, I don't. There probably is corruption. There's corruption everywhere. There's corruption in every country, including especially in the West. We've just legalized a lot of it, right? But exactly. There's probably, I wouldn't be surprised if there's corruption within the North Korean government. I don't know. I can't, cite specifics. But to blame the quality of life entirely in the government is wrong, given the history of what we've both spoken about. And if people in the West actually wanted North Korea to flourish, like obviously lift the sanctions and enable trade with the country. And that again just kind of speaks of the hypocrisy of those that are wagging their finger at North Korea and blaming the government, but like not addressing the fact that our governments are a huge part of the problem.
Then one last question then on North Korea is many people would say that the reason why North Korea is so impoverished, of course, they completely leave out the monstrous sanctions of mass destruction that's in place on North Korea, or they pay very little attention to the Korean War. In fact, very little is actually taught about the Korean War, surprisingly. So we actually don't even know the terrible, chemical and biological weapons that were used on North Korea. But others would say that like, oh, well, North Korea is impoverished because they're spending far too much money on their nuclear weapons when they could spend it on feeding their people. How would you respond to that talking point?
I don't know how much money they're spending on their nuclear weapons, but I think, I don't know. I'm just thinking, I don't know how much is being spent on nuclear weapons. I don't know how much is being spent on the people. But I do know America's infrastructure is shit. And Americans don't have free healthcare. North Koreans have free healthcare. North Koreans have free education. Americans don't. And how much money is America spending on war? And not just war to defend itself, because is North Korea attacking other nations? Or is it building the capability to defend itself? America is attacking other nations. America is never defending itself. It's always attacking. How many, I saw some really grotesque statistic of how many wars America has instigated, and it was only until 2001. It was on a great interview I saw last week. I forget the statistic though, but the point being, like, again, whenever
72 or more countries, I would imagine, since World War II, and we're just talking about World War II, since World War II,
Yeah, and with like between 800 and 1,000 U.S. bases around the world, like who is spending the most money on military? Who is not feeding their people? What is the state of poverty in America, of homelessness, of people on food stamps? This is before COVID, and now, God, it must be terrible. But that, it's just, again, extremely hypocritical to be denouncing the North Korean government when, number one, you really don't know how much money they're spending on their nuclear weapons or on their people. You don't know. You might think you know because Fox News, CNN, or whomever have said this, but you don't know, and you don't know how if people are really that impoverished or not, or if they're like in Cuba, they are poor, but they're not. I don't want to speak on behalf of Cubans. I've been there. What I saw was yes, there's poverty, but okay, I can speak on behalf of my experience in Gaza. They're desperately poor there, unnecessarily so. They wouldn't be so poor if Israel wasn't gunning down their farmers, gunning down their fishers, and imposing the cruel and immoral sanctions and siege on Gaza. They could actually work and export and import. But I lived there for 3 years, and people find happiness in the very simple things there. They don't have all these material possessions. They can barely feed their families, but they still find joy in the little things. And I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture that North Koreans are all joy, but it's just we have these misconceptions because we've only lived in this one frame, this one society. We don't understand how different societies can work. When I was in Pyongyang, we also went to the zoo and we saw like busloads and busloads of school kids coming to the zoo. And okay, this is probably just another propaganda stunt to appease the tourist, right? Or maybe it was just a normal day.
Yes, because that's exactly what people are going to say. That's exactly what people are going to say. Yeah.
It's a normal day where children, this is another side. Okay, I'll finish my point. A normal day where children are doing what children in the West do. They're taking a school trip somewhere, in this case, the zoo. And it was actually a pretty well done zoo, although I'm not much of a person. I don't like zoos. But the aside that I was going to say is we were visiting, I think, the birthplace of Kim Il-sung. And I remember I was waiting for the rest of my small group, and a number of young women, probably high school age women, walked by in their school uniforms. So I started filming their feet because whereas they all had the same haircut and the same uniform, they had different footwear, and some of their shoes were like really fancy. And I remember just thinking like, well, that's interesting. Like I thought these people like were all robots and they couldn't be individualistic, and I thought they couldn't afford okay, I'm not saying that sounds silly. I'll retract that. I'm not saying that they can afford, but you know what I mean? It's just it's one of these little nuances where maybe they're not completely miserable, maybe just our perception, and because we've been bombarded being the appropriate word given the history, with all this propaganda that we're not willing to consider that growing up in this system, they've never known the opulence that we have. They've also not known the perversions that we have. And they've not known the propaganda that we have in our worlds, because we do have them. We just don't see them, most of us. And it's quite possible that growing up in their world, albeit sheltered, albeit cut off from the rest of the world, they could be happy, When I went to the mausoleum of Kim Il-sung, we were requested to dress respectfully because this is a place that North Koreans, especially the elderly ones that go there, they loved the man. They see him as their liberator, and they were crying for him. And again, I know how the Western perspective would be like, oh, look how brainwashed they've been. But no, you didn't live in a country that was nearly destroyed, and this is the person that brought you out of the ashes. So yes, they're going to have a great deal of. We don't cry for our leaders because our leaders are all corrupt scumbags that lie and do wars, right? We have no concept of actual patriotism. So I just think that, again, not to paint their society as perfect or ideal or whatever, but I think it's wrong to view it through the scope of Western lenses.
We have a lot of decolonizing to do. That is for sure on the West, and I know and I think in closing, when you think about how we've been misinformed on Palestine, how we've been misinformed on Syria, how we've even been misinformed on Ukraine. It's simply amazing how we've been lied to so much, to the point that we think of freedom in the Middle East as the Gulf states with their over the top modern buildings and so forth like that. And we're meant to look down upon the achievements of Iraq under Saddam Hussein or Syria under Assad, where, okay, yes, it may not look like New York, or it may not look like London or Doha, but it's a country but these are nations which have actually like achieved a lot, but due to the fact that they're in the crossfires of Western imperialists and their Gulf allies, we're just meant to just completely pardon my language, but completely shit on them.
Yeah.
And you were saying about North Korea, in closing, that we need to approach North Korea in a completely different narrative from the one we've had, which is just they're evil communists, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to get into political systems and ideologies because, well, that's a whole nother topic. But
yeah.
but again, yeah, I just think that a lot of people's the way they approach what they think they know about a particular country, whether it's Venezuela or Syria or North Korea or the republics of the Donbass, it's I know it's hard to say like inform yourself when most people can't travel to those areas, but and I guess like how can you convince people to read a variety of sources? You can't. And people are creatures of habit, and they're probably going to continue watching CNN and so on. But for people who are actually curious, and think like are willing to consider, just step back and try to find other sources than the ones that are ultimately emanating from the powers that want to destroy these countries. I mean, look at Syria. It might not, and thank goodness it's not like Doha. It's a beautiful country. People maybe think Syria is completely destroyed, or they probably think it's like largely desert or something like that. Syria has massive amounts of desert. It also has very lush green areas, and along the coast and beautiful mountainous areas. And even cities like Aleppo, which were badly destroyed due to the presence of terrorists and the fighting of terrorists against terrorists, there are still beautiful areas intact. And I was in Syria last year for 6 months, and in March I went to Aleppo and I saw some of the old souks, the old markets being rebuilt and restored. And these are like ancient markets, so they're being restored in ways that respect their historic construction. They're working on restoring the mosque there that was badly damaged. And they're on that trip and on previous trips, I saw what they do is they take the stones and they've numbered them, and they've numbered them in the sequence of, I don't know how it works, but of how it's going to be reconstructed. So it will be identical in appearance to the original mosque or the original buildings, the original walkways. Look at the village of Maalula, an ancient Aramaic speaking village. They're like the only.
So these are some of like the oldest Christian civilizations, right?
Yeah.
And you've spoken with many Christian Syrians who say that there are no such thing as moderate rebels. These are all that's completely non-existent. Therefore, we support Assad staying in power, right?
Not just Christians, Sunni Muslims. Aleppo is predominantly Sunni Muslim. It also has Armenians that would be Christians, but and other Christians there, but they're predominantly Sunni Muslim. And Aleppo didn't embrace the so-called revolution; it was forced upon them. And so, therefore, in the reporting on Aleppo by corporate media, they were always talking about the eastern and other pockets of Aleppo that were occupied by these terrorists. When they talked about Aleppo being bombed, that's all they were talking about. They weren't talking about greater Aleppo, which had at the time like 1.5 million people, including people who had fled from the east away from the terrorists to the government areas so they could be away from the terrorists. And then as a result, were being shelled by the terrorists because they were attacking the city itself and not just the military, not just attacking the military, I should be clear. So it was like, I think it was mid 2012 when the terrorism reached Aleppo. But I talked with many people and they did not support the revolution, including one trip. It was the trip with the other journalists. We met with a few different Sunni sheikhs, and they were on hit lists for terrorists because they refused to participate in the so-called revolution. They refused to, preach these sermons in their mosques that were like the kind of sermons you would hear on Al Jazeera, the kind of hate speech and sectarianism you would hear on Al Jazeera. So for those crimes that they didn't participate in this, then they were put on hit list for the terrorists. So it is an important point that that Christians see I can't remember how you phrased it, but see the army and their president as defending them, but also Sunnis and also minorities in Syria. Yeah.
Well, in closing, I think that's probably a good place to end. Well, Eva, I hope this will be the first of many conversations. Actually, I always wanted to interview you because I always was fascinated by your coverage of Syria, interviews I'd heard of you on the Jimmy Dore show, and as well as the Global Research and News Hour. So I hope this will be the first of many conversations. And it's we need to take back the word controversial. Instead of Eva Bartlett, controversial journalist, it should be counter-versial journalist, since you do counter.
I like it. I love it.
Since you do counter, propaganda and
you've got to trademark that. You've got to copyright that.
And and the whole point of this show is all about inconvenient truth telling and myth busting, and you've certainly done a lot of that. So, Eva, thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to having you back on in the future. And enjoy your time with your dogs, and tell them I'm sorry if I took too much attention away from them.
Okay, well, thank you for a great conversation.
Likewise.